Hello and welcome to AutoMoments, coming to you from my 1972 AMC Ambassador. And now that winter's over, I've finally been able to enjoy driving it. But for this particular video, I've got a lot of reading to do, so I'm going to keep it parked and keep things safe here. But what we're talking about is our recent time warp test drive about the 1954 Kaiser Special. And if you haven't watched that already, you should definitely check it out. The video was a lot of fun to make, and a lot of people have told me they enjoyed watching it. But with any big video, there's always things you have to leave out, and so I'm hoping this follow-up Q&A can help answer some of the questions people had. And you see my stack of questions here that I took from the comments section. We've got a lot to go through. But before we get started, I have a few minor corrections I'd like to apologize for. The first is that in the video I mispronounced Kaiser Willis. It's Willis, and I accidentally said Willys. And it's funny, my entire life I called it Willis or Willis Overland, but then as I was working on this video, I had some memory of talking to a guy where he called it Willie's Jeep. And I just thought, oh, I really don't want to screw that up and upset the Jeep people. And of course, I second-guessed myself and I screwed it up. So I'm very sorry. I know it's not Willys, it's Willis. It's Kaiser Willis, it's Willis Jeep, it's Willis Overland. So please forgive me for that mistake on my part. And then the other thing is, lots of World War II enthusiasts pointed out that Henry J. Kaiser did not build battleships, he built Liberty ships, which Liberty ships were supply ships. They were still critical to the war effort and made a huge difference, but they were not used in combat, they were used for carrying supplies. So thank you for keeping us honest and pointing out those things. A third comment that we got a lot of were people asking where or how did we film that segment. And you notice we had that gorgeous footage of the car driving over the dam and these aerial shots that a friend of mine is a licensed drone pilot, a drone videographer. And so I had him get these gorgeous shots of the dam and the reservoir and that kind of thing. As for location, it's north of Baltimore. There's a reservoir there, there's a dam there. It's kind of off in the woods. And many of you made the connection there that Henry J. Kaiser worked in construction before he got in the car business, and he helped build great dams like the Hoover Dam and Grand Coulee and things like that. That particular dam was not built by Kaiser, but we still thought it was a nice visual connection. Now, on to your questions. Leo von Stadler asks, what is the color name or color code for the Kaiser? Well, I had to ask the owner for this one. He said the roof is called Australian Beige, and the body is called Copper Dust. And I have to admit, I loved the colors too. I thought it was gorgeous, but there is a small part of me that thinks that Kaisers look better in lighter colors because it makes the safety glow taillights stand out more, and it really looks great. But once again, that car was gorgeous too. It's just a personal preference thing. Frank says, I share your thoughts on this car's styling. What is the difference between the Special and Manhattan models? I kind of mentioned it in the video, but the main difference between the 1954 Special and Manhattan is that the Manhattan had the supercharged engine with more horsepower, whereas the Special just had the regular inline six. That's the biggest difference, but there were other differences in terms of trim and stuff like that, that the Manhattan was a more expensive car, so it was more luxurious. Another significant difference is that the Special had the early Specials, which were based on the 1953 bodies, and then the late Specials, which had the updated rear window. And the Manhattan didn't have early and late editions, it only had the newer rear window design. 11094 Derek says, great video as usual. Thank you, Derek. Do you know how many supercharged models were built? Okay, so I actually had to go back and do some research for this because the numbers are kind of confusing. For 1954, there were an estimated 3,500 early Specials built and 929 late Specials, all with the same base six-cylinder engine. Kaiser made 4,325 supercharged Manhattans for 1954, but 270 of them went unsold and were retitled as 1955 models. I do not know if the 1954 production total was updated to reflect this. Next, 1,231 Manhattans were built for 1955, but 1,021 of them were exported to Argentina, leaving an estimated 210 for the US market. So, if my math is correct, the total number of supercharged Kaiser Manhattans sold in the US was 4,535. All 1954-55 US Manhattans were supercharged, but I do not know if the models exported for Argentina were.
I do know that all Kaisers built in South America were not. Once again, the records from Kaiser Willis are incomplete and somewhat confusing, so it's possible that these numbers are incorrect.
Milo Cat asks, does that particular car have the feature where the back seat folds down and the trunk lid and back glass lift up? No, this car doesn't. What he's talking about is the Kaiser Traveler and Vagabond, which were a sort of hatchback design which was supposed to be an alternative to a station wagon. And it saved Kaiser-Frazer a lot of money because it was cheaper than building a separate station wagon body. And it's a really cool idea. There's like a tailgate that folds down and then the rear folds up, and it's basically a hatchback before Americans knew what a hatchback was. And there was even a Frazer version of it too, but the Traveler Vagabond hatchback only lasted from 1949 to 1953, so there was no 1954 version. Although, I seem to remember seeing on the internet somewhere that somebody made one by combining two cars, but you know, that's all stuff made after the fact. There was no factory Kaiser Traveler for 1954. Francisco asks, how big was Kaiser compared to other American automakers? How did the company come to be, and why did it go under? Well, Francisco was one of several people who asked questions like this, so I'll try and do my best to respond to all of them. In terms of size, Kaiser was very tiny compared to the big three being GM, Ford, and Chrysler. Right after the war, their cars actually sold pretty well, even outselling companies like Nash, Hudson, and Packard. But consider this. In 1954, Ford built over 1,165,000 cars, and those are just Fords, not Lincolns or Mercurys. In the same year, Kaiser Willis built around 21,000. So that's a huge difference, and about 12,000 of those cars were from Willis. So you can imagine, by 1954, Kaiser sales were dreadful. In terms of product, Kaiser-Frazer and later Kaiser Willis were obviously limited in that they did not have the enormous resources of the big three. So that meant they couldn't offer as many body styles and trim levels and models and engine choices, and they couldn't afford to do yearly styling changes like the bigger car companies did. But they also had engine problems. Their 226 inline six was just adequate for the late 40s, but then once the early 50s came and consumers started wanting more horsepower and there were new V8s on the market, they fell way behind the competition. And that's what the supercharger with the 1954 Manhattan was supposed to help compensate for. Now, one thing we didn't mention in the video is that Kaiser did do a little bit of development work on their own V8 engine, but that never came to fruition. Also, they did look into buying motors from Oldsmobile, but that fell through. Now, the company's origins are a little bit more complicated. Around 1944, Joseph Frazer took over the remains of the Graham Page Car Company, with plans to build a new car after the war. Now, in 1945, he needed money, so he decided to partner with Henry Kaiser, which led to the creation of the Kaiser-Frazer Corporation, which was originally separate from Graham Page. But eventually, Kaiser-Frazer decided to buy all of Graham Page's automotive assets in 1947. Now, as for why the company went under, it's both a simple and complicated answer. The simple version is that they couldn't make enough money. Now, the reasons why they couldn't make enough money were complicated. They had issues with overproduction, out-of-control costs, labor expenses were high, sales were poor, and so it was sort of a vortex of things that, you know, inexperience combined with not enough capital, combined with bad timing, all caused the company to decide to leave the car business. After shipping car production to South America, Kaiser Willis did find moderate success in the US market with Jeep, mainly because they were pioneering an all-new product of four-wheel drive vehicles. But by the late 1960s, Henry J. Kaiser had passed away, and the company just wanted to get out of the automotive business altogether. So along comes American Motors. They decide to buy Jeep, really turn things around, and launch an SUV boom in America that's continued to this day. Geek1405 asks, why do cool companies always die? And technically Kaiser didn't die, they were bought out, and you could say that their legacy continues through Jeep, but I get what you're saying. And I spend a lot of time thinking about car companies that went out of business. But sometimes I think the reason people find them interesting is because they're gone. If Kaiser was still around today, they'd probably be making boring, generic SUVs and crossovers just like everyone else, and we probably wouldn't care about them. But the fact that they went out of business is what makes us appreciate them more. Or at least that's just my theory. Questionable Content asks, what were Kaiser's most popular, weirdest, and least popular cars? Well, I don't have the numbers right in front of me, but they obviously sold the most four-door sedans. And if you look, that was sort of the basis for most of their product. And using that basic four-door sedan, they were able to create two-door cars, hardtops, the Traveler and Vagabond hatchbacks, and even some four-door convertibles. But all of those used the same basic platform, and the four-door sedan was their bread and butter. Now, in the fall of 1950, Kaiser introduced a compact car called the Henry J, and that's because Henry J. Kaiser had this obsession with building a sort of modern Model T, a car for the common man kind of thing. But unfortunately, a regular Ford, Plymouth, or Chevy didn't cost that much more than a Henry J, and so most people were willing to spend the extra money and get a lot more car. And so from 1950 to 1954, only about 130,000 were built. Now, I don't know about the weirdest car they made, but if you're talking about rarity, technically the 1955 Kaiser Manhattan is the rarest, but the 1955s were basically the same as 1954s, except for a slightly different hood scoop. Now, the 1954 Kaiser Dragon sports car, which was only made for 1 year, and they only made 435 copies, that is the car that on the collector market is worth the most. People pay a lot of money for those. Other collectible Kaiser-Frazers include the four-door convertibles and the Kaiser Dragon. Now, what is the Kaiser Dragon, you ask? Well, multiple people commented about it, and so yes, I have heard of it before. The Kaiser Dragon started out as a trim option in 1951, then it disappeared and came back as its own model for 1953. The name Dragon came from the vinyl used on the seats, which looked sort of like alligator hide, but since it was synthetic, they decided to call it dragon skin. This was another example of Kaiser having unique interior options that other car companies didn't. And unfortunately, Kaiser Dragons were expensive, so they didn't sell very well, which in turn makes them very collectible today. Donald Grand commented, "I believe my father told me that Kaiser built a car for Sears. Is this true?" And yes, long before Amazon and Walmart, back when Sears was the king of retail, they did make an agreement with Kaiser from 1952 to 53 to sell a rebadged version of the Henry J called the Allstate. And it had slightly different features and trim, but they only sold 2,363 of them, so it wasn't really a big success. Continuing on that theme, Dr. Akbar asks, did the production of the Sears Allstate cars help or hinder Kaiser sales? Well, total Henry J production was around 130,000, so the 2,300 Allstates that were made were probably just a drop in the bucket. I mean, it was maybe nice for Kaiser to find a way to unload those extra cars because they were having trouble selling Henry J's already. But I did read that some dealers were less than pleased that customers could go order a car from Sears rather than buy it from their local dealership. And I thought, just imagine today if Amazon.com started selling cars and how mad your local car dealership would be about that. Here's another fun fact. The Henry J was actually the first car to be manufactured in Japan after World War II. Kaiser had an agreement with Mitsubishi to build them, and there's actually a picture in one of the Kaiser newsletters of it, so that was pretty cool. Bennett Fox asks, can you tell me more about that sexy windshield? I have no idea, but I am so enamored with that part on these cars. Well, Bennett is one of many people who find the Widow's Peak windshield to be very cool, and what I was able to find out about it is that the Widow's Peak windshield stems from the Kaiser design that debuted for 1951. The famous stylist Howard Dutch Darren, who the Kaiser Darren is named after, had an on-again, off-again relationship with Kaiser-Frazer, and he did most of the work for the 1951 redesign, although the 1954 facelift was not done by him. So collectors call it the Widow's Peak windshield because it sort of resembles that. Now, there is a rumor that the windshield was created by accident by a designer that couldn't draw straight lines, but that's not actually true. Most historians credit Darren for coming up with that Widow's Peak on purpose. Hutchcraft CP says, beautiful cars. Anyone know how many are left in the States? And with fewer than 9,000 built between 54 and 55, my guess is that they're pretty rare. Maybe the Kaiser-Frazer Owners Club has a registry that could tell you how many people own them, but otherwise there's no real way to count how many are left. All I know is I hardly ever see them at car shows, and that's why I was so excited to find the one that we drove. Marvin Doolin says, "This guy was a 9th grader in 1954? I was a 5th grader then. He'd have to be at least 79 years old. When did they film this?" Well, I guess I didn't explain things well enough. I was not in 9th grade in the 1950s. Go out! That was when I read The Last Onslaught on Detroit, and I saw 54 Kaiser for the first time and fell in love. Now, this book was published in 1975, and it was already like 30-some years old by the time I read it. So no, I am not in my 80s. Dill Error asks, is there any link between Kaiser and the Volvo Philip? They largely look the same. Did Volvo develop it and sell it to Kaiser? So I hadn't heard of the Volvo Philip, and I actually had to look it up. It was a concept car built with the intention of selling it to the American market. And aside from the two cars looking very similar, I was unable to find any connection between the 1950s Kaiser and the Volvo Philip concept. There is one photo in here that just briefly mentions that they look the same, but there's no mention of any cross-pollination or connection or engineering or styling or design or any breeding between the two companies. But after looking it up, I do see the connection. The rear door does look almost like a photocopy of the Kaiser. So maybe Volvo designers were thinking that Americans wanted to buy cars that looked like the Kaiser, which if they'd looked at Kaiser sales numbers, they'd know that wasn't true, but whatever. William Moore says, you left out the aviation side of the company in the production of the C-119. True, Kaiser did have a lot of experience manufacturing different things for the government, and the company did hope that airplane production during the Korean War would help offset losses from the car business. Unfortunately, that's the kind of detail we just didn't have time to go into in our video. Even though it is important, it's not a huge part of the story we were trying to tell. Jude Thaddeus says, did Kaiser-Frazer ever make their own engines? Weren't they all made either by Continental or by Willis? Also, the Kaiser Dragon debuted as a 1954 model. The Corvette was out in 1953. How did the Dragon beat the Corvette to market? So there's a lot to unpack here. First, we'll talk about the engines. The Kaiser and Frazer cars all used an inline six that was designed by the Continental Motors Company. And Kaiser-Frazer did buy engines from Continental, but Kaiser also leased a Continental factory and produced engines there for themselves, giving them sort of better control over the supply chain. So yes, it was a Continental design, but Kaiser was building it for themselves. Now, Kaiser engineers did do a lot of tweaking to the engine to make it better suited to their needs, as it wasn't originally designed for use in cars, and so it had issues with vapor lock and overheating and stuff, so they were constantly tinkering with it to make it better. As for the Henry J and the Kaiser Dragon, those cars didn't use the Continental engine. They used 4-cylinder and 6-cylinder engines that were from Willis Overland, which of course Kaiser eventually merged with Willis. Now, to answer his question about the Dragon, in the video I said at the tail end that the Kaiser Dragon was the first fiberglass-bodied sports car in America, beating the Corvette, which we're gonna have to split some hairs here. So the Kaiser Dragon was first shown to the public in 1952, about 2 months before Chevrolet introduced the Corvette. So it was the first car announced to the public, technically making it the first American fiberglass-bodied sports car from a major car company, not including weird one-off productions and small-time little conversion shops and stuff. Now, production delays meant that the Corvette actually went on sale first, but historians do agree that the Kaiser Dragon was technically first, although the Corvette went on sale first. So then after that, he asked me another question saying, I know some of the remnants of Graham Page, which hadn't built a car since 1941, were acquired to form Kaiser-Frazer. How much of the old Graham Page company carried through to Kaiser-Frazer? This is the kind of thing that this book can explain far better than I can, but the simple version of it is, if you look at early advertisements, the Kaiser car says it's a product of Kaiser-Frazer, and the Frazer car was a product of Graham Page, because they were still two separate companies in a partnership to build separate cars that used a similar design. The full details are kind of confusing, but for financial reasons, Kaiser acquired Graham Page's automotive assets, and that gave Henry Kaiser more control over the enterprise, which eventually led to his falling out with Joe Frazer. That's the simple version. RM asks, was the L226 engine the same as the Willis Super Hurricane used in Jeep wagons and trucks? They look almost identical and have the same displacement and were both used at the same time in different companies with the same parent company. I'm not an engine expert, but according to Wikipedia, it does say that the Willis Super Hurricane engine did come from Continental. You know what they say, if it looks like a duck and quacks like a duck and has the same displacement as a duck, it's probably a duck. Sheldon Campbell asks, how many cars actually play fake engine noise? Honestly. And so in the video I made a reference to the fact that the Kaiser has quiet exhaust compared to modern cars where they put fake engine noise in through the radio speakers. And there's actually a surprisingly large number of cars that do this. I know that the Lexus UX, the VW Golf GTI, the BMW M5 are just some vehicles that do that. Now, there is a distinction between cars that have a microphone that pipes real engine noise through the radio versus other cars that are literally just playing like an MP3 file for you. So different cars do it differently, but there are quite a few new cars on the market that put either fake or simulated or amplified engine noise through the radio while you're driving. And I think that's kind of silly. Show Knife Man 2 Mikado says, all through the video I had one question nagging me, something you should have concluded with. Now that you've driven one, would you still want to own a 1954 Kaiser? And was it anticlimactic? And I kind of talk about this a little bit. I said my dream of driving the Kaiser came true, but I guess I should have gone into more detail. And while the 1954 Kaiser is beautiful to look at, it's not the most exciting car to drive. But I knew that going into this, that it wasn't a sports car or anything. So I kept my expectations down, and as a result, it wasn't a letdown. It wasn't anticlimactic. I knew what I was getting into. That said, I'd still love to own one, and I still think they're gorgeous, except I'd want to get a Kaiser Manhattan with the supercharged engine, just because it has a little more horsepower and it's a little more collectible too. And our last question is from Horsey McHorseface, who asks, which do you like better, this or your Ambassador? And it's always tempting to ask myself this every time I drive another car, but I actually don't like to make this comparison because I see my Ambassador as like a long-term relationship, and so just like with a significant other, you can drive yourself crazy constantly wondering if you could be with somebody better. And so I don't like to make that comparison because there's just something intangible about this car that makes it right for me. But unlike a significant other, it doesn't get jealous if I go spend time with other cars. And while we're on the subject, I have some big news about the Ambassador. I finally ordered a replacement vinyl top. And so our next video is going to be all about taking off the old top, and I'm kind of scared about what we're going to find under there, and getting it all cleaned and prepped, and then getting the new top put on. And so that'll be a lot of fun, and I hope you stay tuned to watch it. And in the meantime, I hope you check out our other videos, especially the video on the 1954 Kaiser if you haven't watched it already. And until next time, thanks for watching.
That doesn't work. Go out! It's a good thing I brought this.